Hello, I'm Jim Colucci. Today is April 30th, and I am here in New York City interviewing James Lipton for the Archive of American Television. What was your name at birth?
James Lipton.
Okay. That was your full name? Any middle name?
No, I don't have a middle name.
Okay. And when and where were you born?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan on a date we share, you and I, September 19th.
Okay. And what were your parents' names and what did they do for a living?
Their names are Lawrence and Betty. My mother was a school teacher, my father was a poet, which is to say that he did very little for a living.
And did that make it challenging for your childhood? I understand your parents did divorce while you were a child.
Yeah, I was 6 when my father left. But both before and after he went, we didn't have a lot of money. Poets don't make much money, didn't then, don't now. It's not a very lucrative profession. My father was a very good poet, and after he left us became a very famous poet with the Beat Generation. But it did mean that we didn't have a lot of money.
Did you have siblings?
No.
Okay. So when you were growing up, and then it makes sense as an only child, were you particularly interested in books or radio and things that would shape your future career?
Well, I always hesitate to say this because people think I'm lying, but my mother has given me evidence to prove that it's true. It's she who told me this. I could read when I was 1.5. My father, being a poet, I think probably couldn't wait for me to read his poetry. My mother, being a teacher, enjoyed the exercise anyway. At 1.5, I could read. And by the age of 3, I was writing poetry. I couldn't write it out yet, but I would dictate it. My father would transcribe it. Fortunately, none of it has been preserved. But I'm told they were lengthy poems. I mean, I was busy writing poetry.
And did you think, based upon your father's life, that might be something you would have gone into, or were you shaped by him?
No, I wasn't thinking in terms of career at the age of 3.
But even in
But I was surrounded by literature and poetry. I was reading. It was such an important part of my life that I simply mimicked it. I would read poetry, or I would hear them read poetry, my parents, and I would listen to it. And so I wrote poems.
And as you got into later schooling, for example, I'll just ask the name of it, what high school did you attend?
Central High School.
But
I was writing a lot before Central High School.
Okay.
After my father left, my mother and I lived alone in a very small apartment. We moved from her parents' house after they died. And during the summer, my mother worked. I was a latchkey kid before the name was current. And in the summertime, I had nothing to do, no place to go. I was in a little apartment. My mother, always providing for me, had given me a typewriter. Sort of a primitive old thing, but it was a typewriter and it worked. And that summer I wore it, and that summer I wrote 3 novels.
And which summer was that? How approximately?
12th summer of my life.
Wow. Okay. Now you obviously were very, prolific as a child, because I believe it was while you were still in high school you got your first professional gig, correct?
My first job was at the age of 13. It was decided by the family that I had to help by that time. And so we scrounged around, and I got a job washing glass in nitric acid in a photo engraving plant. Now, in those days, a photo engraving plant was a huge camera in the middle of a big factory room, and it used great plates of glass which had been coated with emulsion as a negative. Then they had to be soaked in nitric acid and washed clean with lumps of carbon, and then they would be recoated and used again. So that was my job. I spent my 13th summer in a shed in the middle of this room because the nitric acid fumes were toxic. And to protect the workers, they closed me in a shed with an electric light bulb over my head. And I would reach into this vat on my left and pull out these huge sheets of glass. Now, they've been used so many times, their edges were jagged. And I would cut myself, of course, 2 or 3 times a day. Not deeply, but enough. And when you're immersed in nitric acid, it hurts. So I pull out the glass and my hand, bleeding sometimes, put it under the glass, under the water that was meant to clean the glass, and wash the blood away and wash the nitric acid off my hands so that it hurt less. Then I would do my job, put it into a vat on my right of clear water where it waited to be reused. Well, this went on week after week. It was boring, painful sometimes, but boring mostly. And so I devised a scheme, and the scheme was that I would spend the summer translating popular songs into Latin. Fortunately, the public schools that I went to in Detroit, while they were not very elegant, they did teach some things that are of value. They taught Latin to us quite early, and I loved Latin. So I translated as many songs as I could that summer into Latin. I would sing them in my shed in a piping voice because my voice hadn't quite changed yet, until one day the owner of the place flung the door open and said, "You will stop at this moment or you're fired, because the workers are threatening to go on strike." They just couldn't stand the sound of this little voice singing in Latin. But that was how I spent my 13th summer. If you would like to hear Cole Porter's Night and Day in Latin, I can deliver it to you.
Can we hear a line?
Well, it's easy at first. Nox et dies, tu es unica, sola tu sublonum. No. Wait, no, Bob, would you like to hear Cole Porter's Night and Day in Latin?
Yes, please.
Very well. I included it in my book, and this is what it sounds like. Nox et dies, tu es unica, sola tu sub lunam, aut sub solem, sive probeme, sive procul, non nullius mementias cara, ubi tu es, de te cogito. Dies et nox, nox et dies.
And are you saying that the Detroit workers didn't necessarily appreciate that on their shift?
Maybe the Catholic workers did. The other ones objected.
Now, did any of this, it seems like you're a performer from an early age, did any of this...
No, I wasn't.
Well, that was performing. I mean, maybe it's just to appease yourself, but that was...
No, but I wasn't a performer.
Okay.
I wasn't an actor or anything like that.
Well, what about...
I was a guy who washed glass and nitric acid in a photo engraving.
Okay.
That's all I was.
But it did lead you to the Lone Ranger, perhaps. I mean, eventually.
Not the Latin.
Not the Latin, but I mean, just that person.
What happened there? I was writing. 3 terrible novels when I was 12, but I had nothing else to do for my summer. That's what I did. And then, should we wait?
You're just starting to talk about writing the novels when you were 12.
I did. The 3 terrible novels when I was 12. A friend of my mother sent them to a publisher. Grosset and Dunlap, without identifying my age, and they wrote a letter to me. They thought I was an adult, and asked me to consider them my publisher. I didn't follow up, but it was writing all the time. That's what I did: reading, writing. And the acting was definitely not a part of my life. I acted in high school in a school play, but it was meaningless. It wasn't what I thought about or cared about. The transition came when I joined the Catholic Theater in Detroit, which was a very good theater group, and did it just for fun, for something to do. One night after a performance of the play at the Catholic Theater, a fellow came backstage. His name was Ernie Ricca, and he was a director in Detroit. And he said to me, "You could be a professional." And I said, "Well, I'm working at the Detroit Times as a copy boy, and I have to earn my living. I always had to earn my living from the age of 13 on. I always had to have a job to help support my mother and myself, of course, and to get me through school." I was in high school then, and And he said, well, you could, I said, look, I don't expect anything, no miracles, but eventually do you think I could make as much as an actor as I'm making as a copy boy at the Detroit Times? And he said, I think I can guarantee that. And so I joined the union and I went to work and I began to act in Detroit. The only thing that was going on in Detroit that paid me money was radio. They had a couple of very famous shows. The most famous was The Lone Ranger. And then there was The Green Hornet and a couple of other shows. And the few actors in Detroit earned their livings as a stock company at WXYZ, which is where these programs originated and went out to the whole country. Well, lo and behold, an audition came up on The Lone Ranger, and I took it, and I got the part. I played Dan Reed, the Lone Ranger's nephew. This was radio. I was just a kid, and I joined that stock company, and I had a job. And it was perfect. And I was transitioning from high school to college, Wayne State University, and it was ideal. I could earn enough money to help Mother and me keep food on the table and pay my tuition. And the hours were great. We recorded the show at night. It was live on the East Coast, and then we recorded it for the West Coast. And it was just perfect. I could do my homework, I could earn a living, and I liked it a lot. And because I was still very young, what the audience heard was the Lone Ranger saying, "Out Silver, away!" And Tonto would say, "Get him up, Scout!" And I would say, "Come on, Victor!" That was my horse, was Victor. So that's how I earned my living while I was going to school.
Right. And then you went to, as you said, Wayne State. What did you study there?
I was pre-law. I was going to be a lawyer. Look, one thing I was certain of as a kid, whatever my father was and was doing, I did not want to do. He had left us penniless. I hadn't seen him again. I saw him once when I was 12 and again when I was 21. And I knew about him. He was in the newspapers occasionally. He married many times. He married a woman named whose pen name was Craig Rice, and they wrote mystery novels together. And then ultimately he became one of the great beatnik poets and wrote the definitive study of the beat generation called The Holy Barbarians. So here was this disreputable guy, and I was terrified that if I ever involved myself in the arts, even though I was inclining that way, beginning to incline that way, writing, acting, that I would turn out to be a reprobate, I guess. It was foolish. Nowadays, I think people would have got that out of me, made me express it, and would have possibly have changed my mind. But I was on my own. I was always on my own. Mother worked. I had to think these things through for myself. And so I simply went in the opposite direction. What's as far as you can get from a poet? A lawyer. And so that was my study. I was really seriously going to be a lawyer.
And until what point? In other words, at what point did you change your mind?
This is how it changed. I was busily going to school. I was on my way. I was getting there. And then I had to do military service, so I volunteered for the Air Force. I went into the Air Force. And when I came out, one thing I knew for certain, I was not going to live in Detroit, no matter what. And so I headed for New York, the purpose being to finish my education and practice the law. I was still firm about that. But remember, I'd discovered that the best way that I could earn a living while I was going to school was to act. Perfect. The hours were good, the pay was better than being a copy boy at the Detroit Times.
So you realize the irony there, though. Acting was your day job to put you through law school, as opposed to so many people who have straight jobs as their day job to act.
That is precisely the irony.
Yeah.
It's like the old joke about I'm an actor, but what I really want to do is wait tables. And so I came to New York, and I had it all mapped out. I would soon be finished. I'd be a lawyer, and it would all be behind me. But I got to New York, talking about New York in the 1950s. My God, the track was so fast. Everybody was living in New York. I mean, the migration to Los Angeles hadn't happened yet because television hadn't moved everybody out there. And Brando was living in New York. And I mean, name them, all the great actors were living. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward and Julie Harris. All these amazing people were living and studying in New York. Why? One of the main reasons they lived in New York was because that's where the teachers were. Stella Adler, Harold Clurman, Robert Lewis, the Actors Studio led by Lee Strasberg, Sandy Meisner. Why would anyone live anywhere else? Those acting classes were historic, not just for what was being taught in them, but for who was in there learning. Everybody was going, well, I looked around and I said, I'll never get a job in a million years. I won't be able to finish school. I'll never be a lawyer. These people are going to act me right out of the room. So I said, well, just to strengthen my avocation, I'll take a few classes. And I went, and I'd heard about her, and I went and met with a woman named Stella Adler. And she said, why do you want to study with me? We talked. She said, I'm accepting you. And I entered her class. It was a 2-year program. And I figured, this is perfect. I'll get strong enough so I can compete, finish the old law degree. About 6 months later, after 6 months of Stella Adler and this amazing stimulation and information, this electric life that she'd led me into, I woke one morning and said, who are you kidding? I no more want to be a lawyer than I want to dig ditches. I'd rather dig ditches at this point. I want to act. And then began more than 10 years of my life. 10 years in which I was a full-time student. Now I worked a lot. I worked quite successfully, but I was a full-time student. 2.5 years with Stella Adler. 2 years was the course, but she asked me to stay for another 6 months and to assist her as a director in the class. 4 years with Harold Clurman, founder of the group theater, her former husband, and 2 years with Robert Lewis, out of the group theater as well. I studied modern dance with Hanya Holm, Alva Nikolai. I studied classical ballet with Ella Duganova, Cicchetti technique. I studied Russian technique with Benhar Karvi. I studied voice up to the operatic level with Madame Gautier, Arthur Lessac. I was completely immersed for 10 years.
And that's a very well-rounded acting education. It's not just dramatic acting, but it's music, it's dance.
When it came time to create the Actors Studio Drama School, what I did was I conflated the 10 years of my education into a 3-year master's degree program. But I was there for 10 years. I could have had 3, 4 PhDs.
Now, I know you said you performed during that education
Yeah.
as well. Did you gravitate toward any particular type of roles? You know, as you said, you had some music, you had dance. Were you trying for musical theater? Were you trying for straight plays?
No, musical theater, that's another story.
Okay.
But no, I was acting. I was acting very successfully. I was in the theater. I was in Lillian Hellman's play, The Autumn Garden, which was directed by Harold Clurman, a big Broadway show. I did a number of plays. Television was beginning to be the thing, and I did a lot of television.
Is this live television, right? This is the 50s
Yeah,
in New York.
right,
so live
50s,
television.
60s.
Right.
And so I was acting a lot, but I was acting in New York. You could live and act in New York and be
Right.
paid, earn your living.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about television because this was, we all talk about the golden age of live TV in the 50s. What was the first time that you, first of all, remember seeing television, thinking that it was an option? You had come from radio and you were working in theater. What was your first exposure to the medium of television?
My first exposure as an actor to the medium of television was something that has stayed with me. It's in all my biographies. People ask me about her all the time. People have fun with it. The great thing about New York was, and is to this day, that Whereas the television that existed and exists now in Los Angeles precludes you're doing anything except it.
Right.
They shoot in the daytime, they shoot at night, it's all consuming. But there was a phenomenon in New York called the soap opera. There were many soap operas employing hundreds of actors. It paid you enough to live, and what you could do was work in a soap opera in the daytime. What did that mean? You could act in the theater at night. All of these acting classes that I'm talking about, nearly all of them, took place at night. Clerman's class, Bobby Lewis's last class, we used to meet at 11:30 at night. Why? Because that's where you would go after you had finished your performance in the theater, and we would learn then to act from 11:30 at night until 1:30 in the morning. We were all young, we didn't care, we didn't have to sleep. That was my life. That was all of our lives. And the soap opera, if you look at, if you watch Inside the Actors Studio, look at the number of people who have been on that show who went through it. Meg Ryan, to Morgan Freeman, to me, all of us. It was a perfect fit. You would act during the day, you'd get paid. What would that pay for? It would pay for your acting lessons. And then when you were lucky enough to get a job in the theater, piece of cake. And what they used to do in order to keep us on the soap operas was write us out of the show on a Wednesday afternoon so we could go and do the matinee. Saturdays and Sundays didn't matter. It was perfect. And if you look now to this day at any playbill in the theater, it says Mr. So-and-so or Ms. So-and-so has appeared on, and there's a whole list of soap operas. The soap operas played a very important role in New York, in the theater. Without them, if the soaps had all gone to Los Angeles, we'd have very little theater because the acting pool would have vanished forever. Now, there are enough people who can remain in New York, and have been since the 60s, to populate the theater. And then the stars come in and do 18 weeks or something. But the people who really populate the theater are people who manage somehow to live in New York. And the soap opera was the means to that. I seized on that, and as luck would have it, I've written about it in my book, and when I was writing it, I was laughing so hard I could hardly type. I had forgotten about it. I appeared on a show called Guiding Light. Guiding Light is about to play its last episode in September.
September 18th, actually, right? Right before your birthday.
Yeah, it will be 72 years old. And it began on radio, of course, long before I ever came to New York. But the thing is that I auditioned for it, and I got a role. And the role was a young fellow, a basketball player. Well, you can see me. I'm average height, 5 feet 9 inches tall. That's it. Erna Phillips, who lived in Chicago, famously wrote Guiding Light, and she was the greatest soap opera writer of all time. She was a wonderful woman. And Erna didn't care about things like that. So I came on to break the heart of her leading lady, a young woman named Kathy. And we had a romance for 2 weeks, and then I broke her heart and left town. She wept, real tears, and but by then something had happened. Erna had fallen in love with me. That's the way Erna did. She would sit in Chicago and she would watch her show each day. And if she liked you, oh boy, that day, and she only wrote about 2 weeks ahead of the show. She was always late getting her scripts in. So suddenly you'd find yourself having big scenes and more to do. But she was stuck. She'd written me out. I was gone. I'd performed my function. Hard to believe, but a month later, Kathy answered the door, and it was me, Dick Grant. And she said, "Dick, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm a resident at Cedars Hospital here. I had graduated from high school, gone to college, pre-med, studied medicine for 3 years, and done my internship in a hospital in 4 weeks. And I was Dr. Dick Grant with the golden hands.
Today
I was
they
a
call
surgeon."
They call that soap opera rapid aging syndrome today.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And you know what? Nobody blinked. Nobody ever noticed. There wasn't one letter, one phone call. And then began years when I played Dr. Dick Grant, and it was a very popular role, and all was well. And that did subsidize those 10 years of study. And what happened was that eventually Erna got another bee in her bonnet. She was starting another show on NBC. She had As the World Turns and Guiding Light on CBS, and she and she's starting a show called Another World.
But before we get to Another World, can I ask you a little bit more about Dr. Dick Grant?
Oh, certainly.
Sure. You know, first of all, I'm going to ask you to be immodest here. Was Dr. Dick Grant a heartthrob?
Well, in those days, they didn't have the daytime Emmys then.
Right.
There was a magazine, or television, whatever it was called. It was the big television magazine. They gave awards, gold medals. This, before there was nighttime, but not daytime awards yet. And I won it. I was the most popular leading man in soap operas. I've never told anybody that before, but that's a fact. I have the gold medal upstairs.
I can see
somewhere.
You've got awards around the room.
It's not among those.
No. But now tell me, you had talked about what a day was like, obviously, with your studies and with performing in the theater at night. Would that leave time to rehearse soap opera scenes? Were you doing these kind of on the fly or on the seat of your pants? How quick was the pace back then?
It was lightning. Now they shoot out of sequence, but in those days we used to shoot in sequence.
Right.
Had to learn the whole show and do the whole show. It was fine. I didn't mind. I was young, and it was a place to practice. I would learn something from Harold Clurman at night, or from Stella Adler, or from Robert Lewis, and the next day I would have a big scene and I could apply it. I'm not saying I was good, but it was a remarkably appropriate occupation for where I was going.
Right.
I mean, you can see how far I've come from the law by this time.
Right, sure. And other acting roles, before we even get to Another World, I believe you were on You Are There. Was that at this time in the...
Yeah, I was on You Are There several times.
Okay.
Yeah.
Playing what, do you remember?
I think I played Abraham Lincoln's secretary.
I believe, were you Michelangelo at one time?
Oh boy. That was directed by Sidney Lumet. I played Michelangelo making the David. And it was a big role in a very important show. And they looked all over the world for it. And Michelangelo made the David in his own image. And so one of the things they had to do was to look and look and look at us and find somebody who looked something like the David. They decided that I did. They built my nose up they took the bridge out of my nose, so it was a kind of
More
Greek profile, yeah. And then, and I played that role. They brought a, there is one copy, I think, in America, perhaps in the world, of the David. The David was made of very soft stone. That was why it was given to such a young man. He was nobody when he made the David. And so here was a piece of stone that was too soft. None of the other sculptors wanted. They gave it to Michelangelo, and he carved the David. But because it was soft stone, they never allowed plaster casts to be made of it. They allowed one. It was in the university. No, it was in the museum in Boston. And Sidney Lumet and CBS got a hold of it, and it was shipped down there, 2 guards. And it was on the set. It's from here up. It's just a bust. But then they put a drape over it as if the rest of the body existed. And I stood on what appeared to be a scaffolding, and the camera was down on the floor. There I was. And there was a scene in which I talked about art, a huge scene. There was a young apprentice, and I lectured him on the subject of art. And as I did, I was supposed to be polishing the nose, face of the David. And I was using a piece of ivory soap. And down on the floor were my fellow artists of Florence, and a jury of my peers, to say the least. And they were, one of them criticized, said the nose was too long. It actually happened. Vasari says it happened. And so they, when they left, I said, I'll fix it. Oh, no. While they were there, I fixed it. And I said to the to my assistant, my apprentice, bring me a chisel. He brought me a chisel and a hammer. He brought me a chisel and a hammer, and so this is part of the script, and I hammered away, and I said, and I whispered to him, bring me some marble dust. So he poured the marble dust in my hand, and I faked the chisel and the hammer, and I let the marble dust fall. And my colleagues below said, perfect. Now it's perfect. But at the dress rehearsal, the chisel slipped, and I took a piece out of the nose. Well, I saw this little chip fly. The only copy in the world of the David. And so when it came after that, after he had done the pounding, Michelangelo then was supposed to polish. So I polished it with the ivory soap. At a school for poor children, I studied sculpture. So I knew what I was doing. And I took the ivory soap and I was rubbing it on the nose and filling in the chip. To this day in Boston, if they ever wash that damn statue, it's gonna foam.
So this video serves as your confession.
That's right. That's right. But the statute of limitations has run out.
Good, good. And I don't want to leave the 50s too. I love that. Without talking about such a terrible experience for everyone, the blacklist. Were you affected by that? Did you know people who were? What was the environment?
God, we all knew people who were. There's a picture behind me on the wall here. It's a drawing. My wife bought it for me. That's a drawing by Zero Mostel, the great Tevye, who had been in the 30s apparently a painter, an artist before he was ever an actor. And she bought it for me because I did know him. And when he was blacklisted, and people used to go down to his studio, he returned to art, and we would all sit in his studio, and he would be inspired. While he was painting, he would be Zero Mostel the lunatic. It was a performance. And he had a hat rack with different hats on. He would change hats. Every time he put a different hat on, he'd be a different character. Still painting. Sure, we all knew people like that. Some of them were they were driven out. They were driven away. I met Dalton Trumbo because I was in his play. He came to Broadway to try to earn a living. While he was blacklisted, he wrote a play called The Biggest Thief in Town. And that was my very first Broadway job. I was an understudy to the juvenile in it. And I got to know him and his wife and his kids. And so we all knew people like that. I don't think our country was unsafe because they existed.
I can imagine there was also a culture of fear. Did you feel vulnerable? I mean, here your father, ironically, was a beatnik poet, right? So did you feel like there was any kind of danger to that?
Yeah, but the beats came after that period,
Okay.
so he was never, although he was always a radical.
Right.
I suppose he had come under attack in his life. I don't know.
But
I didn't know him. I
It
just
didn't transfer to anyone having any problems with your work or.
No, I worked on the soap opera all that time. Nobody
Right.
bothered me. But I certainly knew a lot of people, and all of us were very sympathetic to the people who had been attacked. I mean, it was very hard to like Joe McCarthy.
Mhm.
Very hard. And those people, they struck me as being not very nice folks. And I didn't think they were especially patriotic or that they were a perfect example of what America was and could be and should be.
No. You started to lead us into another world before. I just wanted to ask you about Guiding Light. You ended up staying on that show for quite a while, 10 years, I believe.
Yeah.
Did you have any?
On and on.
Okay. Did you have any idea when you started that you would stay that long, and what was your
No,
reasoning?
but remember that you said the magic word, 10 years.
Right.
As long as I was on that show, I could continue studying dance, voice, acting. Harold Klemmer was turning me into a director. I was directing everything in that workshop for 4 years, as well as acting in it. And so it was a perfect subsidy. Why would I not do it?
And how did the character evolve? Of course, I'll just say it as you're taking a break. How did your character evolve? You started.
Is this abuse, by the way, what I'm doing?
I'm sorry?
Is this abuse?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Did your character, you said he started out at his reappearance as a resident at the hospital.
Yeah.
Did he evolve over those 10 years? Did you have particularly juicy storylines with certain
Oh,
co-stars?
huge. I ended by, I've never actually totted it up, but it is my belief that I married everybody on that show except my mother. yeah, I had love affairs, and a marriage, and I was busy.
And
Golden hands, you know.
Yeah. Were there co-stars that are of note for us to remember that you were playing with in these scenes?
Well, Susan Douglas played Kathy. That was the big thing, the big romance.
Okay.
There were other people on the show, but it was that was the Kathy and Dick were the famous.
You were the super couple of the era in that show.
Yeah.
Now, you left the show in 1962. Was that because, as you said, Erna was developing Another World? How did that come about?
Actually, I think I began writing before that.
Okay, tell me about that.
Erna, when she created Another World,
Right.
Procter & Gamble said to her, "You can't write 3 shows." She decided the person that she trusted to turn the show over to was me. And so I began writing Another World. She had 3 people whom she was developing. I was an actor, the other 2 were writers. And they were, of course, Bill Bell and Agnes Nixon. It was never my intention to stay in daytime. Writing paid a lot more than acting, so of course I accepted it.
And you had said you had done a little bit before this opportunity came up as a writer on daytime, or?
No, that was my first daytime job.
Okay.
And so when it was offered to me, I said yes. Ultimately, I wrote several daytime shows. I created Love is a Many Splendored Thing. I wrote on, I don't even remember all that I wrote on. I did several. It's in my biography, but I forget which ones.
Well, I can jog your memory. Return to Peyton Place.
That was mine, yeah.
The Best of Everything, and Writing for the Doctors.
Best of Everything I Created.
Right. Writing for the Doctors.
Yeah, I wrote for the Doctors.
Capital.
We won an Emmy, and I wrote for Capital.
So we can get to those in all in good time.
No, you don't have to go through them. Each one served a purpose. I don't mean to sound, it makes me sound, I think, rather callous and selfish and uppish. I was never above it. I flung myself into it. I did the best that I could. But it was always, there's no question, it was for me a subsidy, a great subsidy. I was deeply grateful for it, and am to this day. And I always gave it everything I had. But by the time that I was writing soap operas, I had begun doing something else. You could see that acting was the bridge. What was the one thing I didn't want to do? Write. I felt if I wrote, I'd turn out like my father. By this time, he was a big-time beatnik, and more eccentric than ever, notorious. And so the barrier began to break down when I decided I wanted to write a musical. And the soap opera subsidized that. My first musical was called 1962, as I recall. And I wrote the book and lyrics. I had a Broadway show. I had a Broadway opening at the Winter Garden Theater. And they knew that I was doing it. P&G, they were wonderful to me. They encouraged me in this. They were so pleased that I was doing it. And so I wrote a Broadway musical. And that's where you see it all came together. The acting, the dance, the singing, all the voice work, directing, everything came together. It made perfect logic to me in a musical. So I wrote my first Broadway musical. That's when the real transition began.
But I think you're being modest in probably underestimating how much responsibility you had as a day job as a head writer for Another World. I mean, what kind of day-to-day responsibilities?
It was huge. You were responsible for the long-term story, the short-term story. You did the outlines for the second writers to write. Then you had to correct because you had to make it all fit. You had 3 or 4 different minds writing on the same subject. And you'd have to rewrite what they wrote in order to bring it all together.
And was Ernest still involved? Were you under her
No.
tutelage still, or?
No, ultimately. But we remained friends to the end of her life. I owe her a debt. She couldn't write dialogue to save her life. Not to save her life. If somebody put a gun to her head and said, write a good line of dialogue, she would have said, pull the trigger. But what she did brilliantly was she would plot these. She had what she called her squares. She taught me to do that, and Bill Bell and Agnes Dixon. And here were these squares. It looked like a checkerboard, empty. And then she would fill in for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and on one side she'd have each of the characters, so you knew what everybody was doing every day. And that's what I learned from her. She would plot those things. I never got as good as she was. Nobody did. Nobody did. She could plot those things so that you were absolutely stunned at what happened. And she would take such delight in weaving this web. She was conspiratorial, wicked, and quite daring for those days.
And then other writers would lay dialogue on top of it in terms of she would give the outline.
When she wrote the show, she always wrote her own dialogue,
Okay.
which was a mistake.
And so you'd punch it up.
Oh, it would be changed in the studio.
Change it.
You do have to. Well, sometimes you have to turn it into English.
No, you mentioned about how daring
But she could plot.
Yes. You mentioned how daring she could be. Were the scripts and story ideas subject to a lot of network approval? Did you find a lot of
Yeah,
interference?
I was the first. I was the first character to be involved in an abortion story. But we couldn't call it abortion. We had to call it an illegal procedure. But it was the first time on television.
And well before 1973.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And what other subject areas were taboo that you guys tackled?
I don't remember. I really, you're asking me too much about the soap operas because they're not. They were. I stress to you that they were not. Although I worked hard on them, they were never my primary goal. They just weren't.
So then, rather than talk about, as I said, I mentioned so many of the shows from Return to Peyton Place all the way up to Capitol, which ended in 1986. So really, we jumped.
I did that as a
Capitol
favor to a friend, John
Okay.
Conboy.
Okay.
I went in there and I went in for about 4 or 5 weeks, and I did a year's storyline for him. I did it as a favor.
Okay. So condensing all that into one chunk, just what was your strength in the genre in terms of what you brought to it and how it changed over your time?
Anything, I don't know that I had any strengths, but if I had them, I learned them from Erna. It was being able to weave that mysterious web. I got quite good at it, and also I wrote good dialogue.
Okay. And did the strictures of doing the genre or the environment that you were operating in change during those many years that you worked in soaps?
Sure, it changed, but again, you're asking me questions that are so much less important than the questions you might be asking.
Right.
if
Well,
I
that
may
we're
say
going to
so.
get to. That we're going to get to.
No, I implore you to, because I'm
Okay.
afraid of running out of time.
Okay. So, I'm going to move into some TV specials and movies then. Just a few things before we get to the Actors Studio. You wrote and produced Jimmy Carter's inaugural gala. How did that come about?
You're not interested in the musicals, eh?
I am interested in musicals. I'm
Because
just
they
trying
preceded
to
the- they-
Okay, tell me about that then.
I wrote Nowhere to Go But Up, and it was directed by Sidney Lumet. It was a story about 2 crazy prohibition cops. And in my book, I talk about the opening night of it. By the time we got to New York, I knew that we would not succeed. For a very particular reason. I just hadn't written it well enough. I'd written the book and lyrics. And it was the Winter Garden Theater. It was a cold night in November. In those days, people used to come to the opening night of a musical in formal dress. No one would think of coming in anything but long gowns for the women and black ties for the men. And I was standing at the back of the theater, feeling gloomier than I had ever felt in my life. And I was heartbroken. And there, people rushing past me in their formal dress. And I did something that I've done a few times in my life. I taught myself how to do it, which was to step outside myself and talk to myself. Not out loud, or people would have taken me away, but to have a discussion with myself. And for some reason that night, I did. I stepped outside myself, and I looked at myself, and I said, listen to me. when you sat down and wrote Act 1, Scene 1, you made this happen. Because you did that, these people are rushing in, the orchestra's warming up, the cast is throwing up. Everybody's getting ready for this opening night on Broadway at the Winter Garden Theater, one of the historic theaters in New York. And if at that time a genie had popped out of a bottle and said to you, make a wish, would you have said, swear to me that it's going to be successful? Or would you have said, just get me there? Get me to that opening night. You know what you would have said. You're an ungrateful son of a bitch. Every one of these people is here tonight because you wrote Act 1, Scene 1. And at that moment, the cloud lifted. I felt a kind of elation. And at precisely that moment, a couple came in. I was very young. They saw this kid in a tuxedo. They thought I was the usher. So they handed me their tickets. Well, we were so poor when I was a kid. The only way that I could see theater, and the way I did, was by being an usher at the Cass Theater in Detroit. That's how I started seeing theater. Because you could work for free, but you could watch the show. So I could take you to your seat. Anyway, I said, yeah, right this way, took them to their seats, gave them their programs, came up the aisle, feeling like $1 million. Now the story would be perfect if only the show had succeeded. It didn't. But nevertheless, I've never forgotten that moment in my life and the lesson that it taught me.
Well, and the lesson is, yeah, I believe, being present in the moment. And is that something that applies
No,
to
the
acting?
lesson is just get me there.
Right.
The lesson's in the work.
Right.
And I was very grateful. Actually, that evening ended. Everybody else was in despair. I was sad, but I felt okay.
Now, just to clarify, this was, you said you had started working on it in 1962. Was that also the...
It was the opening night.
That was
No, I'd
opening
worked
night.
on it for a couple of years.
Okay, so it opened in 1962. Okay. And then, as I said, we're going to move on to some TV so that we can make sure we get a good amount of time for the Actors Studio. So I just wanted to ask you about some
But
of
wait,
those...
there was a second music.
Oh, please do. I didn't have that, so please tell me.
In 1968, I wrote a musical based on The Man Who Came to Dinner, called Sherry. And that was a much more successful effort. And we got the star we wanted. It was George Sanders to play Sheridan Whiteside, based on Alexander Wolcott, this curmudgeon. And he was perfect. He could sing. Anyway, to make a long story short, composer Lawrence Rosenthal and I taught him the songs at my home on that piano. And then we went to Boston to open the show. And just before opening, I got a call from the stage manager saying that he wants to see you. He's locked in his dressing room and he's crying. And I was staying at the Ritz. I ran across the park. It was a snowy night. I went into the theater and he let me in. He wouldn't talk to anybody but me because he knew me because I'd taught him the score. Here was George Sanders crying. He'd just been told, he and his wife had just been told that she was terminally ill and would die in 3 months. And he said, "You've got to get me home." I said, "Of course. Just open the show, please." Well, he was so distraught. We had to cut it down to nothing so he could get through it. But you know, in theater, you don't complain, you don't explain. And we got terrible reviews. And we had been the fair-haired boy in New York. Everybody said, this is going to be the big hit of the season. But what they saw in Boston was not the show we'd written. And then we started casting. We cast Clive Revel, brought in a new director who was his choice. And then we had to open in Philadelphia, and George agreed to stay with us that long. So we had a second opening in Philadelphia. The same show that we had done for him got slammed again. And the word was that we were dead in the water. Then we replaced him, rehearsed on the road, came into New York, did what we could to restore our show. Never got to the show we'd written, and the show failed. Not miserably. The score did extremely well. It was okay. It was respectable.
Now, your involvement, was it the book, or were you
Book
involved
and
in the
lyrics.
score?
Book and
Lyrics as well.
Book and lyrics.
And I understand
yeah.
that recently you had a cast recording release of
What
this.
happened was that there was no cast recording. We didn't run long enough to have a cast recording, which I regretted. What happened was that over the years I had many requests for productions of Sherry, based on The Man Who Came to Dinner by Kaufman and Hart, famous play, and the score had been very successful. The title song had gone to the top of the charts. And so when I got the first request, I called my publisher, Chappell, and I said, would you please deliver the score, the orchestral score, to this producer, because when the show closes, it's put into a trunk and sent to your publisher, the author's publisher. I was the author. And they said, what score? It had never arrived. To make a long story short, it was lost. And over the years, over many, many, many years, over decades, there was no production of Sherry because we could never deliver the score. We didn't know what had happened to it. It had vanished. We thought that the trunk perhaps had gone with the set to New Jersey and been burnt with it. In any event, a young fellow called me named Robert Shear, and he said, I heard there was a pirated. Somebody went in with a woolen sack in his lap in one of the last performances. And he said, that's a great score. I said, don't bring it up. It's a wound that is closed. And he said, you've got to reconstruct it. I said, forget it. We'll never put it back together again. It's all, every part for every instrument, etc. And so he called me, kept calling me, and he said, listen, there's at the Library of Congress is the great repository of the American musical theater. Maybe there's a few sheets of music that would start Larry Rosenthal again, inspiring. You could reconstruct. I said, you're crazy. And he called me back a couple of hours later. He said, are you sitting down? I said, yes. He said, it's there. The trunk is there in the Library of Congress. Untouched, unopened in all these years, every note, every single sheet of the score, it's yours. At that time, Nathan Lane was on my show. I said, you'd make a great Whiteside, because he was doing Man Who Came to Dinner on Broadway.
Right.
He said, I'd love to hear it. Carol Burnett was on my show, and I said, oh, would you be wonderful as Lorraine? Bernadette Peters was on my show. I said, oh, you were born to sing Maggie. Anyway, they did, and we recorded it about 3 years ago, and it's the delight of my life. We restored it to what it had originally been before the tragedy to George Sanders and his wife. And there it is. It exists at last. The score is complete. It's a beautiful album of Sherry.
I love that story, and I also love that you managed.
You love it. Imagine how
I can imagine how you feel, and I love that you managed to cast it from your job on the Actors Studio.
Mike Myers. The only person who hadn't been on Inside the Actors Studio was Tommy Tune, but he was a friend. So we had a great cast, incredible cast, and they gave me their hearts and their souls, and they performed it as I dreamed of hearing it. At last I heard the score. I'd never heard it. Neither had anyone on Broadway.